This chapter 9 is on application of international trade, and we're going to look for answers to these questions. What determines how much of a good a country will import or export? Who benefits from trade and who it harms? And if the gains outweigh the losses, which they do. And if policymakers restrict imports, who benefits, who is harmed? A lot of times they're going to be doing this off of wanting to get reelected, wanting to get people to vote for them, not necessarily what is best for an overall economy. So do the gains from restricting imports outweigh the losses? This is what we'll analyze. Last one, what are some common arguments for restricting trade, and do they have any merit? So what we have to understand and remember from Chapter 3, our prior knowledge, is that each country has a comparative advantage if they produce the good at a lower opportunity cost than other countries. They can gain from trade if they export the goods in which they have a comparative advantage. So you don't have to be better than another country at it, just have a comparative advantage in that good. And we can apply the tools that we learned in the last couple chapters regarding welfare economics to see where the gains are coming from when you trade and who they're going to. So this PW is the world price of a good, the price that prevails in world markets. So it might not be the same price as in your country, it might be higher, it might be lower, but that is the price of the good in the world. The PD is the domestic price without trade. Domestic means within your country. So if the domestic price, the price within your country, is less than the world price, then you have a comparative advantage in the good. You're doing it cheaper at a lower cost than the rest of the world. You have comparative advantage in the good, and that's the good you should export out. If there's free trade, of course. If the domestic price is greater than the price of the world, well, your country's going to be better off by importing that from other countries, and you should realize you don't have comparative advantage and import the good under free trade from the other country because they have lower prices. We're going to have to make an assumption, like anything in economics, this is a model, that small economies are price takers in world markets, that their actions aren't going to have any effect at all on the price in the world market. This isn't always true. Obviously, the U.S. is a large country, but it will help us to make sure that we are staying true to this model. So when a small economy engages in free trade, the world price is the only relevant price, and that makes sense because the seller's not going to accept less than the world price if they could sell it for a higher price in world markets, and no buyer is going to pay more than the world price because they can buy it in the world markets for a lower price. So we'll go through a country that exports soybeans. Without trade, the equilibrium would be at $4 and a quantity of 500. The price in the world we're going to use is a horizontal line, and you'll do this whenever we have a world price of $6. And it's made red here for you so it's easy to see. So under free trade, that hits the demand curve at a quantity of 300. It hits the supply curve at a quantity of 750. So in this case, you can see that we're going to export the difference between what's demanded in our country at that higher price and what we're supplying to the world market. So the export is the difference there, which is 450. So we'll put some letters on the graph here so that we can identify the welfare, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Without trade, so forgetting that this red line is even there, this A and B area is our consumer surplus. Our producer surplus is just letter C. Again, that's going back to the equilibrium. Our producer surplus is always the area between the supply curve and the price. And for the consumer surplus, it's the area above the price below the demand curve. Our total surplus is adding all of the surpluses together, the producer and the consumer surplus. Now with trade, our consumer surplus will just be letter A. And our producer surplus is now C, B, and D because it's always, again, bounded by the price. Our price now is $6, and here's the supply curve. And again, for that consumer surplus, it's the price above the price below the demand curve. So our total surplus now is not just A, B, and C, it's A, B, C, and D. So this is showing our gain from trading that's going to occur, that we're all better off overall. Now, consumers might not be as well off. Obviously, they're having a lower consumer surplus, but producer surplus is much higher, and that should help trickle down to the rest of the economy as well. So this letter D is the gains from trade. So what I want you to do is go through this practice of this analysis of trade. The situation you have is without trade, 3,000 is our price and 400 is the quantity at that equilibrium point. And then in world markets, the world price is going to be $1,500. So what we want to find out is under free trade, how many TVs will the country import or export, and then identify the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and total surplus without trade and with trade. So I'll give you 5 minutes, pause the video, and do this active learning 1. So here's our answers. Under the free trade, the domestic consumers would demand 600 because that's where the world price hits the demand curve. The domestic producers are only going to supply 200 within that country at that low of a price. There's not very many that are going to be able to make a profit at that low of a price. So the difference here will be what's imported when the difference between 600 and 200 is 400. That's how many plasma TVs will be imported. So we'll put our letters on the diagram again. Without trade, our consumer surplus is the area above the price, below the demand curve. That's letter A. Our consumer surplus was B and C. For producer surplus, we've got B and C, the area below the price, above the supply curve. So our total surplus is A, B, and C. Again, that's before trade. With trade, our consumer surplus is A, B, and D. It's the area above the world price, below the demand curve. Our producer surplus is going to be C. It shrinks here, you can see. Just the area below the price, above the supply curve. And our total surplus is A, B, C, and D. And obviously D is representing our gains from trade. So a summary of the welfare effects of trade is right here. Obviously, you can see some of them are going to be rising, some of them are going to be falling depending on what's going on. Obviously, certain situations are better for the producers and certain situations are better for the consumers, but the gains will always exceed the losses overall. So certain groups might be hurt, but overall, the gains will exceed the losses. So some other benefits of international trade, we're going to get more variety of goods. Producers get to sell in a larger market, and they might achieve lower costs by having a larger scale that they can produce on. And competition from abroad can reduce market power of domestic firms, which would increase total welfare because there's more competition. And trade enhances the flow of ideas, facilitates the spread of technology around the world, and that's going to help move everybody forward. So why is there opposition to trade? Well, we know that trade can make everyone better off. The winners from trade could compensate the losers and still be better off. But that's not going to usually happen. The losses are highly concentrated among a small group of people. For instance, maybe an auto plant moves down to Mexico and the automobile workers lose their jobs. That group feels it. Everybody else is better off as a whole, but that one group might feel it very heavily. Whereas the gains are often spread thinly over like the whole country, and they might not see that it's directly related to, let's say, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that allowed for less taxes in trading between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. The people don't see that that's why their lives are getting better. So the losers will have more incentive to organize and lobby for restrictions on trade because they don't want it to harm their area. So an example of a trade restriction is a tariff, a tax on imports. This is a tax levied by the government on goods brought into the country. Our example is going to be cotton shirts. The world price is $20, the tariff is $10 per shirt, so consumers are going to have to pay $30 for an imported shirt. That allows domestic producers to charge $30 per shirt because their competition has to charge basically $30 just to get into the marketplace here. So the price facing domestic buyers and sellers will be the price of the world plus the tariff. So if we put the world price of $20 onto this equilibrium here, we can see the demand, buyers' demand in free trade, 80. The seller's only going to supply 25 at that lower price. The imports would be the difference there, which is 55. If we put the tariff on there, the tax, an extra $10, that's what this green line represents, the price is going to rise to 30. The buyers are going to demand 70 where it hits the demand curve, and the suppliers are going to supply 40 where it hits the supply curve. The imports will be the difference, which is 30. Between 70 and 40 is 30. So we'll put some letters on here and say, okay, with free trade, our consumer surplus was everything above the price, above the world price, below the demand curve. So it's A, B, C, D, E, and F. The producer surplus was just letter G, the area below the price, above the supply curve. Our total surplus is all of the letters put together. Now with the tariff, the area above the price of 30 and below the demand curve is just A and B. The producer surplus is going to be, again, above the supply curve all the way up to the new price of 30, which is G and C. The revenue the government is getting is letter E. This is the tariff that they'll be collecting, the $10 times the number of quantity. And then the total surplus is going to be A, B, C, and G, and then also E. So it leaves D and F, and we need to identify what those are. D and F is what we call a deadweight loss. This and this. So let's talk a little bit about what deadweight losses are. Okay, deadweight loss, letter D, is representing the overproduction of shirts. At that higher price, they're going to be producing more than people really want. And F is the deadweight loss from the underconsumption of shirts. You know, they're thinking, oh, at a price of 30, this is how many people will buy, but really the price that we're analyzing this at would be 20. That's what the market really is at. The $10 is just going to the government. So those are deadweight losses. Another way to restrict trade would be an import quota. This would be a limit on imports of a good. It basically has the same effects of a tariff. We have import quotas on sugar right now. It restricts how much sugar can be brought in to compete with U.S. sugar companies. The effect of that is it raises prices, it reduces the quantity of imports. It has caused soda companies to use high fructose corn syrup instead of sugar in their products, which has led to other health problems as well. But it reduces the buyer's welfare when we have an import quota. It also increases the seller's welfare, and it creates revenue. Well, a tariff creates revenue for the government. A quota is going to increase profits for the foreign producers of the imported goods, who are then able to sell them at a higher price when they're able to get into the market within that import quota. The government could also auction licenses to allow countries to export into our country, but they typically do not do that. So there are some arguments for restricting trade. One of them is the jobs argument, that trade destroys jobs in industries that compete with imports, that it's, all of our auto working jobs will go to Mexico. So we have to look at this data and see if that's what's really happening. So if we have more imports, we should see more unemployment. But our data shows the percent of imports as a percent of our GDP, but our unemployment necessarily has not followed that same track. So there's not a lot of evidence that that is true, although that is a real feeling for a lot of people. So we do not see total unemployment rising as imports rise. The reason why is it's offset by job gains in the export industries. So there's more people to sell things to, and that creates jobs within our country. So even if all goods could be produced more cheaply abroad, our country only needs to have a comparative advantage to have a viable export industry and to gain from trade. The national security argument is that, it's an industry vital to national security. We need to have protection from foreign competition to prevent dependence on imports that could be disrupted if there was a war. And economists would say, okay, that's understandable, but we have to look at what our true security needs are. Obviously, producers are going to want to have this special privilege, and they're going to exaggerate their importance to the security to obtain that protection from the foreign competition.